Hello, welcome back to another pen talk. Today's subject is going to be about nibs. A couple viewers requested that I discuss the left oblique nib that I've recently become quite fond of, so I thought I'd see if we could visually take a look at that nib and see how it compares to maybe some other nibs you might be familiar with. And eventually we'll take a look at how they write, which is really the more important part in this review. So we'll start with this Parker 45, and this is the first left oblique that I became familiar with, and hopefully this paper will let it focus properly. Trying to work with sunlight because I think that gives us the best, high def look at this. As you can see, this nib is unique in its shape. You can see how the tipping material and the angle that the grind is there, and there's really no real ball at the end, but it does certainly have the iridium, and it's been ground in a very specific manner. As you can see, it leans to the left, and that's why it's called the left oblique. Mike Masuyama said when you look at the nib this way and it points to your left foot, that means it's a left oblique as you follow it from top to bottom. So this just writes phenomenally. When I first touched pen to paper with this particular pen, I fell in love with it. A lot of it has to do with when you're right-handed, your normal angle is such that really contacts the paper. One of the challenges with this type of nib, if you put it up like this, as you can see, only one tine touches, and you could get dry writing or it could be skipping. And the same thing if you angle it too much this way. But with the right angle, and this one matches what I'm comfortable with writing with, as you can see, it matches up perfectly with the paper. So let's look at the nib that Mike Masuyama ground for me based on the Parker that I gave him. And as you can see, this pen is inked, and it looks quite similar to the Parker 45. This also writes excellently, and to me this gives character to my writing that was missing from the broad nib that was on this pen before Mike did his magic. It also is a little bit sharper, so again, the angle is critical on how it contacts the paper, and this way you can just get a lot of line variation. And this may not be the best way to show it because of trying to write with the angle and everything. So let's look at what that nib probably looked like before grinding. So this is a broad, it's a fusion nib, but it's a broad by Delta. And as you can see how this tipping material in this pen is also inked. It's just a plain kind of like rounded area. This pen writes great, writes first time every time, and it's extremely smooth, but there's no line variation. The horizontal, the vertical, it angles, but it's also much easier to write with than the left oblique that I had ground. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of view on that. I thought we'd look at another nib that people have talked about. This is the broad Pilot 78G. And this is really just a stub nib. As you can see, it's straight across, and there's no tipping material whatsoever in this nib. I think the nib is okay. It's certainly not one of my favorites. Let's go to Twizz B, and this is a 1.1 stub. You can see the 1.1 there. This is I think it's a Yugo nib. I'm sorry, I get confused about it, but this is also a very nice nib to write with. You can get some decent line variation, has decent ink flow, but it's straight across. And so therefore, it encourages you to this, and if you angle it like I like to angle, then you're not going to get as nice of a writing example. The other nib I thought we'd take a quick look at is another nib ground by Mike Masuyama. So this is considered by Franklin Christoph to be a cursive oblique. It's a very fine nib. As you can see, it has some of the sharpness that was visible in the nib that he ground on my Delta. But it's also smaller. This was a medium nib to start with versus the broad on the Delta. This also is an interesting nib to write with, but I certainly like the grind better on the broad nib. This is very demanding as far as angle and how it touches paper, and it has much sharper edges. It's more of an oblique and less of a cursive, which has more rounded edges to it. So hopefully that little view was interesting, and we can take a look at how these nibs write. Let's take a look at how the nib performs on paper. This is the Delta. Zen. That's a bad Z. I'll do that again. And the key thing with this left oblique is the horizontal lines can be quite thin, and the downstrokes we can get some decent flow in ink coming out. What I like is it's just that it feels good on the paper. The line variations are nice. You know, the words have a little bit of character to them. It may not be as obvious from this picture. You can see a little bit of how it works. And again, as you can see, the nib placement on the paper is critical to get the flow. But I just enjoy this nib. As I said, it's hard to keep the camera steady. So it's not coming across in the way that I expected. The broad nib from the Capri, which is basically a similar nib to what was done before Mike ground the other nib. And this is very smooth, glides across the paper, but there is absolutely no line variation whatsoever. You know, no matter what angle you keep it to the paper, it writes fine, which is one of the advantages of this type of regular nib. It's a very nice heavy ink line, but it just doesn't feel good. You don't get the feedback, and I like the feedback that I get with the cursive nib on the left oblique, sorry, on the Delta Zen. A look at the Parker. I have not written much with this, but this is the nib that I fell in love with. Yeah, I think you can see this one is even broader than the Delta Zen, and this is considered an oblique broad. The horizontal lines are not thin, but they certainly are not as thick as the, and as you can see, I didn't have the angle right, as the horizontal lines. The nib doesn't have much give to it, but I just enjoy, it really glides across the paper. I think there we get to see a good example of the vertical versus the horizontal, and as you can see, it lays down a lot of ink. The inks that I'm using I'll put in titles, because at the top of my head I really can't pronounce them. So that's kind of a look at these different nibs. If If you want to take a look at how the Pilot music nib worked, you can take a look at my video that I just did with that pen. And also I did a review on Ancient Copper from the Diamine, which I love that ink. So again, this was a request of a viewer to take a look at the different nibs. Hopefully this helps out a little bit. As usual, when you're in front of the camera, sometimes things don't turn out exactly the way you expect, but from my experiences, I just enjoy the left oblique nib. I thought while we're looking at nibs, I would just add one other one into the mix. This is a special grind by Sailor. Nariaka Togi. I'll put it up, bad with pronunciation. As you can see, this has a tremendous amount of tipping material on it. This pen writes very wet. You can get an extremely broad wet line out of this, and it also varies based on the angle. The more vertical you are, the narrower the line, the more you approach the horizontal. It writes a lot like a brush, a paintbrush. It's certainly an interesting nib, and it's something that maybe if I'm really adventurous, I'll get Mike to take a look at this in another pen show and see what he might suggest, because the nib could use some character, and that's how Mike defines it. It's difficult to write with the camera in one hand and trying to focus on the writing and the nib on the paper, so I wrote this in my normal writing. I wanted to show you how it looks without the pressure of having the camera and the photography at the same time. I think you can see the line variation there shows out a lot more here than I was able to get on the original video. Hopefully you enjoy this. It's a different writing experience, and like I say, I just enjoy it. And I enjoy it because it just adds character, and it also has you focus more on your writing. You know, generally normal nibs are, in Mike's words, a little boring. So when you put a little character to the nib, when you put it to paper, you'll get a different experience. And so that's what I find from these two pens, and I hopefully will add more obliques. I have some more on order, and when they come in, we'll take a look at them and see if they also can provide a similar writing experience.